All right, Erasmus, it's time to correct your misunderstandings. The first time I recorded this, brutal and savage would have been applicable adjectives to describe it. I was told I may have gone just a bit too far, and as a result, I revised the script, and this is the result of it. So sit down and take notes. This period of instruction is going to be your remedial course on evolution. If it's one thing that I really hate doing, it's repeating myself to the same person on the same subject. If you needed clarification, that's one thing. But if you didn't pay attention or decided to completely ignore the explanation I gave because you believe what I just explained is something else entirely, then we're going to have a problem. As a result, I'm switching from Mr. Adam Skeptic, the patient, calm, and polite and approachable science communicator that helps you gain a better understanding of science, to Sergeant Atom, the crude, blunt asshole that's going to instruct you on how this actually works. And your period of instruction starts now. To be crystal clear, there's no debate here. This isn't a competition between two competing sides of the same coin. This is over 160 years of scientific research and a theory that has withstood more and harsher criticism than any other theory and has never failed once, versus deliberate misrepresentation of science in favor of pseudoscience that has consistently failed and been shown to be completely wrong at every turn. Calling it anything but fact versus fantasy would be more polite than this subject deserves. There were a couple of things that I should have expanded on and clarified in what is Evolution Part 1, but they were secondary to the main point. Much of what you had a problem with is addressed in the second part, but there are plenty of things that we need to address here. To start with, let's clarify why the existence of God is irrelevant to evolution. It doesn't matter if a God exists or not. Evolution is a demonstrable fact of biology, and God's existence would not change that at all, nor would the existence of God do anything to help the Bible's credibility at all. The problem is you're not even willing to consider the possibility that the Bible is man made without any input from a supreme or even superior being. The Bronze and Iron Age people that wrote the Bible didn't know anything about taxonomy, cosmology, geology, medicine, or anything else that modern science has provided us knowledge of. And we know that God didn't write or inspire it because the God that's portrayed in the Bible didn't know about any of those things either. That's evidence that the Bible is man made and not inspired by an infallible being. But anyway, your belief seems to be rather extreme, to the point that in your mind, if the Bible is not 100% correct, the people that wrote the Bible lied when it was just ignorant people being ignorant in the first place. I'm not telling you to not believe in God, but you need to join the rest of us in a majority of Christianity here in reality when it pertains to scientific concepts. A book with no scientific or historical accuracy does not refute or in any way pose any problem to evolution. The unfortunate thing is that facts don't care about your feelings or what you want to believe. You can protest all you want, but it does not change the data or the conclusions that it leads to. Christians with a proper understanding of the subject see evolution as the method God used to have the earth bring forth after their kind. Speaking of kind, that brings us to the next point you tried to make. Why would science adapt to an imprecise and flawed labeling system like the one in the Bible? The system in that book is dependent on what things do, not on what they are, which is why whales and shellfish and anything else that lives in the water are called fish, and why bats are both birds because they fly and locusts because they swarm. Kind is a useless label if you move it around everywhere. In the original video of yours that I responded to, you defined kind like we define species, which is a group of biological organisms capable of reproducing without coercion and having viable offspring, meaning that they can reproduce with other members of the same group. This time you moved the goalpost and defined it like we define nested hierarchies and clades. That's why kind is useless as a descriptor, because it doesn't mean anything. And you can use it deliberately or not to make me go further down the cladogram to prove my point. I can do that and follow that goalpost as far back as you want to take it, but you're not going to like where it goes. If you want to say that evolutionary taxonomy is incorrect, you have to show that, which means you have to show created kinds, which means that you have to show things that are unrelated to anything else. As I stated already, that's a point that even professional apologists can't come close to being able to do. To prove that point, I want you to give me two things that you see as separate kinds. I don't particularly care what they are, any two things at all, and I will show you their common ancestry and how we know that they have a common ancestry. And speaking of that, you completely ignored my explanation on the law of monophyly. As I said, evolution does not demand that something become another thing in the way you think it does. It's the key distinction. The law of monophyly states that you cannot grow out of your ancestry. Birds will always be birds moving forward, just like they will always be theropod dinosaurs. People will always be apes moving forward, even if we create new clades as we develop. The common failure point in understanding here is that creationists tend to think that evolution teaches that a bird or an ape gave birth to something completely different from itself, which is in a neighboring sister clade, which isn't the case and is frankly a thought process that reveals profound ignorance of the subject. Listen and pay attention when an explanation is given. We're talking about gradual changes over time to the point that from one generation to the next, you would not see a significant difference unless you were looking at two specimens from literally generations apart. I would have preferred you stayed with what you stated about dogs and cats and horses and cows, implying that they should be able to crossbreed. That would have at least been a simple misunderstanding. But you unfortunately took it a step further, showing something well beyond a simple misunderstanding. Dogs did not turn into cats, and horses did not become cows, or vice versa. Somehow, you did not have an issue with the existence of mutations, but you did have a problem with the way evolution is defined, which, to recap, is changes in allele frequency or descent with inherited genetic modification. I don't really care what you think the definition should be or what you think evolution is, because neither is what you think it is, and shows an astonishing level of ignorance and arrogance to think that you know more than the scientists that have spent their lives studying this from all over the world and from various backgrounds. Less than 1% of scientists give any credibility to creation over evolution. And I don't see them as scientists anymore, since they stopped being unbiased as soon as they signed the Statement of Faith, a document that, with various wording, states that they will thoughtlessly dismiss everything that contradicts the Bible, which is literally just dismissing just about everything in science. Your response of basically saying this is what the definition is, but I think it's this instead, was frankly stunning and infuriating. At any point, did I mention anything at all about the origin of life? No, I did not, because evolution does not cover that. Those that study this subject could care less where life came from or how it formed. Evolution studies the diversification of life, not where it came from. The study of where life came from is abiogenesis, which is a series of overlapping and, in some cases, competing hypotheses that have precisely nothing to do with evolutionary theory. You also seemed to think evolution is a decision on the part of the group as well. No, there's no guidance here at all. A group of apes didn't suddenly decide to become human. Unique mutations in that group started that group on a different path than the other apes. Remember those nested hierarchies we talked about last time? Evidently, you're right on the cusp of understanding this point, but you unfortunately shot off down some random thought process. As I already pointed out, when groups split off, they evolve in their own distinct directions. This is why populations evolve and not individuals. I'm also compelled to ask what would prove the age of the Earth to be in the billions of years to you, since you seem to see time as an issue. You thought pop culture gets evolution right. This is just yet another indication that you don't know what evolution is. Take, for example, the Star Trek episode Genesis from the seventh season of The Next Generation. The basic rundown of this episode is that while Data and Picard are off on a 3-day jaunt to retrieve a malfunctioning photon torpedo from a failed weapons test, the ship's hypochondriac, Lieutenant Barclay, goes to sickbay convinced he has some horrible space sickness because he uses the equivalent of Starfleet's Dr. Google to self diagnose himself. He's given a treatment for an easily curable disease that he actually does have and is effectively told to get back to work and stay out of the medical database. The treatment is an engineered virus, which was just a suspect idea to begin with. But anyway, in the 3 days that Data and Picard are gone, the crew de evolves, which isn't actually a thing, into prior forms in their evolutionary ancestry of the crew's individual species. Troy turns into some sort of humanoid frog, and Worf turns into some kind of freakish predator looking thing, but Barclay goes straight up impossibly weird. See, he's human, and he turns into a freakish amalgamation of a human and a spider, which is straight up impossible. Because, like I said before, you can't grow out of your ancestry. Arachnids are not in our direct line of descent, so it makes absolutely no sense that he would turn into that. The whole episode is just one big violation of the law of monophyly, along with the fact that if anything like that were to happen, it would not be apparent until subsequent generations. What Data and Picard would have actually seen when they came back would have really been nothing. It just would have been the crew seeing some strange changes in their kids while they were developing or after they were born, and any somatic changes wouldn't have taken effect in 3 days. Reactivating latent introns, which are actually things, would not produce those changes in the individual crewmen. And that's not even the worst one. Voyager's second season has an episode called Threshold. That's an even worse representation of evolution that should have had the holographic doctor's program shorting out, trying to sort through what was going on there. I apparently should have expanded on what we used to establish clades in part 1 instead of waiting to part 2, because it appears that I lost you on that point, and the fact that Linnaeus couldn't find a trait to separate man from ape. Clades are defined and determined by core commonalities. We don't look for every little difference because that won't help us classify anything and we won't get anywhere. The traits aren't arbitrarily selected, but I don't expect anyone at AIG to even care about that point. Core similarities are evident and right there in front of everyone's eyes and aren't assumptions, though it may look that way to the layman who isn't familiar with the process of morphological character analysis. Every single differentiating trait that you listed to try to separate man from ape is, to be absolutely blunt, meaningless. They don't use currency, or they have more muscle than we do. We don't care about those things. I was also disappointed with how you blew off the implications of us having broken ape genes in our DNA. If that isn't an indication of relatedness, then what is it? Why would we have MYH16 if we were not related to apes? Also, a paternity test isn't the same thing as trying to match the blood from a crime scene with a suspected murderer. It isn't looking for an exact match. It's looking for common genetic signatures to determine relatedness. This also brings me to vestigial structures, including vestiges in our DNA, which we've already touched on. You're right when you say that I don't care what creationist sources from creationist sites say about evolution. I don't care what they say because they don't know what they're talking about ever and have been shown to be wrong at every turn. Let me know when they submit something to peer review that stands up to scrutiny. Vestigial traits don't necessarily mean that the structure is useless, necessarily. It also means it is diminished in its original capacity or has been repurposed for another function. You mentioned whale pelvises. The pelvis is a structure with a very specific primary purpose. It's a structure needed to support the weight of something on land with legs. This is one of a few indications that the ancestors of whales were land animals and specialized to live exclusively in the water. As for the video you referred to from Minute Physics, I watched that, and as I thought, you didn't have a clue what they were talking about. You ignored the explanation they gave, which wasn't terribly detailed, admittedly. Instead of doing more research, you assumed that they were admitting something that they were not. See, we are 98% similar genetically with apes, depending on what sections you look at. The whole genome will give you different results than looking at the coding and regulatory sections will. I get that what creationists commonly refer to as imprecise language, such as 98% similar, may have been, and must be, probably make it sound like we don't really know what's going on, but that is far from the case. This is going to be a crude example, but it's applicable all the same. If you came home one day and found your girlfriend riding Jody in a reverse cowgirl, he may have only been 98% inside of her, but that must be cheating, right? That's the kind of implications that science is using whenever we use that language. We may not have the whole picture, we may not be 100% certain, but we do have a pretty damn good idea of what's going on. You need to pay attention and dig a bit deeper into legitimate scientific sources next time instead of running back to AIG. They don't know how to do science. In fact, it would be best if you ignored creationist sites entirely and got your information about science from scientists and not people pretending to do science to undermine it. And also, please don't quote mine, it's dishonest. I'm also aware that the molecular clock is used based on average mutation rates, and those rates can change, but not significantly enough to be useless as a tool for estimation. Since we aren't looking for whether the divergence happened on a specific Tuesday or not. As for radiometric dating, it's along the same lines here, but I'll save the explanation of that for my Your Next Period of Instruction series for details. But seeing as decay rates are constant and don't accelerate or change really at all naturally, your objection is just your opinion and does nothing to disprove what we already know about radioactive decay. I spoke with a friend of mine that works with reactors for a living a while back, and he assures me that there's no reason to think that decay rates were any different in the past. Seeing as he went to college for this, and you seem to know very little about it, I'm inclined to believe him, since it's kind of central to his job. I already defined species earlier, but I almost forgot you asked why horses, zebras, and donkeys are not the same species, along with a question of lions and tigers following the same line of questioning. That is because they may be interfertile and able to produce offspring, but those offspring are not viable, as in they are, with rare exceptions, sterile. Therefore, they are all a different species. The whole thing where you think the scientific community had it right when they created the class of Pongo dishonestly and that they just accepted a lie because it was repeated often enough is just flat out wrong. But I'll cover that after you see part two. I do need to cover your misunderstanding of viruses, though. Viruses are not considered alive because they do not meet all of the criteria to be considered alive. How they formed is as irrelevant as abiogenesis is to evolution, but they would have followed an evolutionary path unique to them. Viruses are not distinct from nature and are not evidence of a creator at all. So there is nothing here for me to concede. Nothing about them raises questions science can't answer either. Perhaps you would care to explain why we share ERVs with other apes with your model. I do look forward to your attempt to prove that evolution is wrong and that creation is somehow right, and your video on peer review. However, if this is any indication of what is to come on that front, you will be sadly mistaken in thinking you have a leg to stand on and will quickly come to a potentially frightening realization. You'll have two options available to you: admit you were wrong or lie to yourself to maintain willful ignorance. And about that, echo chambers are not just people you interact with that reinforce your opinion on things. They also include the places you get your information from. For instance, you place AIG on a pretty high pedestal, but when someone comes along with information that contradicts and directly refutes their pseudoscience, you treat it as if it is wrong on principle instead of honestly considering the possibility that another viewpoint could be right. That is what I mean by an echo chamber. You surround yourself with a bastion of sources that agree with you and, frankly, don't stand up to any scrutiny at all, instead of looking at what the other side has to say and giving them an honest look and perhaps learning something in the process. This would be like a nugget looking up the removal and replacement of an aircraft generator in a comic book instead of the maintenance publication. He isn't going to learn anything, and he's going to break the aircraft in the process. This concludes your period of instruction. Now, do bear in mind that I'm hoping that you're taking notes on this, because after you see my part two, I'm going to be going through that in the same manner as this. And at the end of part two, I am going to put together a little quiz to see if we've managed to correct some of the misconceptions that you may have had on this subject. And if not, we will continue to keep plucking away at this until you do. But until then, that's it for now. I'll see you again when I give you your next period of instruction.